Hi folks, it's going to be another senior moment. It's going to be a little different. I've had several people ask me over the years, "Hey Dave, how did you get started doing what you do?" And so I started thinking about it. Last few days when I was doing my daily walk, I was thinking about it. And I thought, well, I think I'll make a video and let, just in case you were one of the ones that are interested in how I got started in doing all of this. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'll try not to ramble too much, but I'll give you a couple of examples. The main reason that I started in the routed sign business is because, as most of you know, I was a machinist for years, and one day I took a few days off, and while I was gone from the shop that I worked at, somebody stole my tools. My toolbox, my big Gershner machinist toolbox and all my tools, they just stole it, the whole box. And so I took a few days and realized that I wasn't wealthy. I was going to have to make a living some way. So I was going to have to go out and spend several $1,000s trying to replace all the tools that I had acquired over the years, or I was going to do something else. And I happened to be at a flea market in California, and I saw a guy routing wood signs, just basically what we all do now. And I thought, gee, that'd be a nice present for my daughter. My daughter Renee, who is now a sign carver up in Alaska. So I thought, well, I think I'll just order one of those for her. So I ordered one with her name on it, and I looked at my watch when I ordered it, and then I sat there and watched, or I stood there and watched the guy. He had a trailer. I watched him carve that sign. And then at the end of after carving the sign, I had already paid him for it. It was $19.95. And I looked at my watch again and I thought, wow, at $19.95, I believe I could do that. So just from buying that sign, I went home, went down to the local hardware store and bought a router. I'd worked with woodworking tools. And went back to my garage and I started making signs. And that's how it started in the winter of 1970 after somebody stole my tools. And so that's basically how I got started in the sign business. But just in case you're interested, I became an entrepreneur. And I didn't even know what that word was, didn't know how to spell it, didn't know anything about it. But I became an entrepreneur when I was about 7 years old. I was probably in the first or second grade. My brother was a couple of years older than I was. And we lived in Salem, Oregon, in a house. I can still remember the house and everything about it. But we lived in this house, and we were 2 houses away from the railroad tracks. And back in those days, and this was in the early 40s, probably the Second World War was going on for probably a year or two. Anyway, the early 40s, and when train cars would come in those days they brought the big logs that they made pulp and paper out of. They brought the big logs for the pulp and paper mill and for the lumber mills. They brought them into this holding yard that was just within a block of our house. And they would bring the cars in, and when they would, I don't know if you know what humping a car means, and it's not what you think, but the cars would come in and bump into each other when they were holding them in this yard. And as the cars bumped into each other, the logs would move slightly, and big pieces of bark, and I mean huge pieces of bark, would fall off of these logs. Well, my brother's job and my job was to cut kindling wood and cut firewood for our stove. We had a wood stove in the house, and my dad would get up every morning and build a fire, and my mom would get up and do breakfast, and then they would both go to work. Us kids would go to school. And anyway, I used to look at those big chunks of bark and I would think, gee, I wonder if those would burn. So I picked up a few of them one time, brought them home, and Mama said, yeah, those will burn just fine. And my dad said, absolutely. He said, I'll make the fire with those at night. So in the morning, when I get ready to build a fire, there will still be hot coals in there. So my brother and I took our little wagon, we had a little red wagon, and we loaded that wagon up with these pieces of bark and brought them home. And that way we didn't have to go out and chop wood, chop kindling and bring it in, or we didn't have to do that much of it. And so at one point in time I started thinking about that, and my dad said that was such good firewood that if we didn't get it, he'd find some place where he could buy it. And that got me thinking. I thought, well, Mom and Daddy don't make a lot of money. I think Mama worked for like 35 cents an hour as a waitress, 35 cents an hour in tips. And sometimes she'd make $4 or $5 in a day, which was a good day for her in those days. And so somehow it got into my mind that if I gathered up enough of that bark, more than we could use, maybe I could get somebody else to buy it, after Dad mentioned that. And so my brother and I, Salem, Oregon, by the way, at that time was the #1 town in the world for canneries. That is, for produce coming in out of the fields and the orchards. And they must have had about 12 or 13 different canneries that canned different things. And there was a cannery about a mile away from our house. And my brother and I went down there one time. And they had these big stacks of gunny sacks, which are burlap bags. And they were just out there like they were free. So we took some. I think they probably didn't intend for them to be free, but we took some of those, took them back, went out and started filling those bags up with bark. And we had 4 or 5 bags of bark, big. I mean, they were almost, like 3.5, 4 foot long, big bags. And filled those up with bark, put them on the wagon, started pulling that wagon, went about a block away from the house. And I went up and knocked on the door, and a man answered the door, and I said, we have big bags of bark off of logs that make great firewood. I just wanted to know if you'd be interested in buying them. And he said, well, yeah. He said, I guess so. How much you want? And I said, well, how about 15 cents a bag? He said, wow. He said, that's a great price. Yeah. He said, give me a couple bags. So the long story short is that's how I became an entrepreneur. I figured out a way that nobody else was doing it, and I figured out a way to make extra money. Mom and Dad, they worked hard, but they didn't make a lot of money. My dad was working at a pulp mill. I can remember him cutting cordwood for 50 cents a cord, and he would cut maybe 3 or 4 cords of wood a day. I can remember that when I was younger than what we're talking about here. But that's how I became an entrepreneur. When I was 7 years old, my brother and I would gather up this bark that fell off of these logs down onto the side of the railroad tracks, and we would sell it. And that's how we made extra money. Now, in those days, Mama would give us a quarter, 25 cents each as an allowance. And for that 25 cents, I could go to the movie for 13 cents, buy a bag of popcorn for 10 cents, and have 2 or 3 cents left for buying penny candy. And that was what I did generally on a Saturday afternoon, as I'd go to movies with this quarter. Well, it turned out that selling this bark, I was making about 5 or 6 times as much as my allowance. And I finally got where I would I'd give it to Mama to buy stuff that we needed. But turned out that I was making a lot more getting that bark, putting it in these bags that I was swiping from the cannery and selling to these people for firewood. And that's how I became an entrepreneur. So that's 2 stories I wanted to tell you about how I started in this business. Number 1, how I started doing signs. But the main thing is how I became an entrepreneur and started thinking. Every time I would look at something, I would think, gee, I wonder if I could do something like that and make some money at it. And I've been doing that all my life, and I'm 86 now, and nothing has changed much since I was, so 80 years ago, when I was 6 years old, is when the whole thing started. So just thought I'd share that with you, just in case you was interested in it. And I'll see you on the next Senior Moment.